It's definitely possible to find games where the 7900 XTX is faster than a 5080, but it's also very easy to find games where the 5080 is absolutely crushing the 7900 XTX if you kick on heavy ray tracing workloads, for example. So this is going to need to be a nuanced comparison. Also, things like how about the upscaling quality? Like, how does it look? They both boost performance, but DLSS does look better. So we do need to take all of that into account, but if you want some of the quick summaries of my overall results, the geo mean of all of my tests shows the 5080 28% faster, but a lot of my tests involve ray tracing. If you filter out ray tracing, the 5080's lead drops to 13%, but I did also notice that Silent Hill 2 was a bit of an outlier when it came to non-RT results. It didn't seem to fit the general average of what I was seeing. And so if you do remove the outlier, which I'm not saying you should, and some people are gonna be like, this guy's so AMD biased just removing that outlier. It's just the kind of thing that you can sometimes do in data analysis, which is if you look at a result that doesn't seem to represent what's commonly happening, it is sometimes more accurate to represent things without those outliers, in which case we are seeing the 5080 take an 8% result. Now, alternatively, you could take the thought process of, guys, I'm spending $1,000 on a graphics card, I'm going to turn on the high-end ray tracing features, in which case you could filter for just ray tracing, and now everybody's gonna be like, this guy's so Nvidia biased. Guys, I don't really care which multi-billion-dollar company is winning. I'm trying to get you information on making informed purchases. Anyway, if you do look at ray tracing, I have the 5080 61% faster on average of my testing, but ray tracing testing is another thing that really needs some nuance to the understanding of it, because even games that are called full path tracing by Nvidia or full ray tracing usually isn't literally fully ray tracing absolutely everything the game is doing. There's usually still some amount of the frame that is rasterized, which means that in general, ray tracing workloads are not evenly difficult. Ray tracing advantage game by game can vary wildly. What we can definitely say is the 5080 is much better at ray tracing than AMD. But what you will see happen on a game-by-game basis is going to vary depending on the game. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which is one of the very, very few games that absolutely requires ray tracing hardware with no software fallback, the lead is definitely noticeable for the 5080, but it's not insane. At 4K, 30% lead for the 5080, 17% lead at 1440p. Again, very healthy lead, but the AMD GPU actually still gets pretty good playable frame rates in that case, and that's without turning on the full RT like path tracing mode. In a game with path tracing mode turned on like Cyberpunk, the 5080 is crushing AMD by 100%, 86%, 97%, 77%. And in one of the few Unreal Engine 5 games that offer hardware-accelerated ray tracing support, which is Silent Hill 2, we see generally like a 50 to 60% performance advantage for the 5080, which is pretty significant. But as I said, that game in general, even with the hardware RT turned off, did seem to be a bit of an Nvidia-favored title. But in the end, yeah, definitely better ray tracing on the 5080. But another question might be, why are we even comparing these? Honestly, if you're buying new right now, I think both of these are kind of out of production. The 7900 XTX available new right now is kind of stupidly priced. It used to be available sometimes as low as like $800-ish if you caught it on a good flash sale, more commonly around $900. But hey, the 5080 instantly sold out at MSRP, and as of the time of filming is now being scalped for over $2,000. So really right now, as of the time of filming, this is a bad time to be comparing the pricing of these GPUs. They were both meant to have a $1,000 MSRP, although the 5080, that's fresh, and the 7900 XTX, that's 2 years old, and it's been available for $900 or less on a regular basis. And AMD should be offering us a 9070 XT soon, but we don't know yet whether it will be more performant than the 7900 XTX. So what we're really looking at right now is the fastest AMD graphics card that we currently have available, which may or may not be comparable, better to, or worse than the 9070 XT we'll be getting soon, up against the newest generation Nvidia card with the most similar, overall price point, at least when they were new. Why am I comparing these? Honestly, some people might be on a 7900 XTX and wondering if the 5080 is enough of a bump to be worth the upgrade. And some people might just be deciding between the two. Hey, I can buy a used 7900 XTX for a pretty good deal. How much better is the 5080? Because I would say the 5080 is definitely better, even if there are a few games where the 7900 XTX comes out ahead. We're going to jump into the side-by-sides now and get a much better look at, is it a real meaningful difference to get the 5080 instead of the 7900 XTX? By the way, it's the Founders Edition 5080 up against the AMD reference model 7900 XTX. And I will mention that there's a lot of 7900 XTX AIB cards that have some crazy overclocking and whatnot that do perform better than the made by AMD models. So if you're thinking your 7900 XTX does so much better than mine, I'm using the closest thing to a reference model I have for both cards. Anyway, and they're both stock. I'm not applying any kind of overclocking. Now, the biggest place you will notice a difference with the 5080, a big advantage if you go with the 5080, is if you want to play the single-player AAA games with path tracing enabled. With performance mode upscaling, with the new DLSS transformer model, it looks pretty usable. I used to not like to go that low, even at 4K, but with the transformer model, it's looking pretty decent. And if you look at these side-by-sides, especially with ray reconstruction for the 5080 with its new transformer model, things look way more stable. If you look like the fencing in the distance, way more stable on the right-hand side of the screen. If you look like the palm tree branches, you'll get a lot more detail and it's a lot more stable on the right-hand side of the screen, the fans in the background. So here, not only is the 5080 twice as fast at path tracing, but also the upscale required to get there looks better. So it both looks better and runs twice as fast, and it's the difference between playable and not really playable. Also, there's frame generation. AMD does have FSR 3 and 3.1 frame generation, although Cyberpunk's only at the 3 version. And it can do a ×2 mode, where it inserts a generated frame in between every two actually rendered frames by the game. The 5080 can also do that by using the DLSS version of frame generation, but it can also go into a ×3 or ×4 mode where there's even more generated frames. I will say that really you need a high enough base frame rate to where the base frame rate before you're applying it feels good. And I will say the 5080 is kind of right on that borderline here. It was about 60 FPS without frame generation enabled, but if I pause this right here for a second, let's take a look at a latency measurement. So you got a latency measurement right here. Nvidia's software overlay can monitor the PC latency. Now what you can see here is that while the ×4 mode gives you more frame rate, it's actually giving you a few more milliseconds of latency as well. You'll notice the difference varies a little bit if I play the video a little bit longer, but generally it's a handful of extra milliseconds of latency. But the important thing to note though is this is not what 102 FPS normally feels like. This feels more like half of that, around 50. So it's gonna feel about as responsive as playing as 50 FPS, even if you get motion fluidity of 100 FPS and some artifacting that you wouldn't see on a real 100 FPS. Whereas this one actually feels a little bit less responsive than that, but it's honestly pretty close. Here you would take the 182 and you would divide it by 4 if you wanted to get an idea of what that would actually feel like. So we're, kind of in the upper 40s as far as what it feels like. This one feels like 50-ish. That's kind of the idea. Now, again, AMD has the same issue where you need a high enough base frame rate. But the problem is here, the AMD GPU was only at about 30 FPS already, and then you take a little bit of a frame rate cost when you do that. So while it's hitting 56 FPS of output, while you might think of 56 FPS as feeling pretty good, I would argue not if you achieved it through frame generation, because it's gonna feel more like you're in the 20s, and the image quality artifacting is gonna be a lot worse. Plus the baseline upscaler is also worse. So here's kind of your best case scenario for the 5080 as far as trying to sell you on is it worth it, right, to go with that. Now I will also say I did feel like the 5080 is a little borderline for 4K path tracing. I think it's much more at home at 1440p path tracing. Here we're looking at RT overdrive with DLSS and FSR set to the quality setting. Even at the quality setting here, if we look at the details on the bartender, the bottles in the background in motion, the chain link kind of fencing in the background and all of that, I do think it reconstructs a lot nicer with the DLSS upscaler here, although the quality level at 1440p for FSR is usable, although it's still only getting the 7900 XTX to 37 FPS here. The 5080 is about twice as fast at 73, and 73 in a single-player game does feel pretty good in my opinion. It's also a decent baseline from which to use frame generation. So if we go ahead and then kick that on again, the 7900 XTX can achieve 71 FPS through frame generation, but again, that's going to feel more like 35-ish, so not that responsive. And it's also, again, going to have more image quality issues because there's a wider gap between frames, whereas the 5080 in its ×2 mode is hitting 126 FPS of fluidity, but also it would feel more like about 63 FPS of responsiveness, which I would argue in a single-player title still feels pretty good. And then if you're on a high refresh rate 1440p display, 240 FPS or so, you could use the ×4 mode, which gets you up to 227 FPS average. It'll feel more like a fourth of that, but again, a fourth of that is just a little under 60 FPS. So it's not feeling too bad to even use that mode. So again, these are the big feature advantages for the 5080. But again, AMD does win in some games. A game like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 is an AMD, favored title, just in general. Plus, we're not using any ray tracing here. So again, helping out AMD in that regard. And here, it's not a dominating victory for AMD, but it is 6% ahead. And you're probably, maybe if you're looking at the used market or you bought one at some point recently, paying a lot less money for the 7900 XTX. So if you're not playing the big, single-player path tracing mode type games, really look into how the 7900 XTX plays in the game that you're spending most of your time in. Because if it's Call of Duty Black Ops 6, for example, you might want to save yourself some money and get the 7900 XTX. At 1440p, the 7900 XTX is ahead by 5%, 250 FPS versus 237. So again, still noticing a pretty healthy advantage here. But again, the results are pretty close. So I think in reality, if you were blind A/B testing this, you just wouldn't see a difference. Also notice how much faster the latency results are here. We're talking 10 milliseconds of input latency. So if you want an idea of comparing, if you know what high refresh rate, competitive gaming at 200 plus FPS actually feels like, and compare it to the generated 200 FPS on that ×4 mode in Cyberpunk, you can see that's a very different number in terms of milliseconds of input latency, just to kind of hammer that home. Now, that being said, there are some games that you can't turn off ray tracing. If you are playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, you will be using hardware ray tracing. That being said, 4K Supreme, no upscaling, the 7900 XTX actually does a good job. This is a well-optimized ray tracing title. 71 FPS with no upscaling, and this is the maximum ray tracing setting that isn't the full RT path tracing mode. The 5080 does doing even better, though, by 30%, so it is definitely a big advantage for the 5080. At 1440p, the advantage drops to 17%, and both GPUs are offering a nice high refresh rate experience, 118 and 138. But again, noticeable win for the 5080. But again, it's showing that not every title is going to be a crazy heavy ray tracing workload. Now, if we move on to Unreal Engine 5, we have Hellblade 2, Senua's Saga. The high settings are the highest settings in this game. It doesn't go to Ultra or anything like that, and also this game does not support any kind of hardware ray tracing. Here we're seeing the 5080 winning by 11% at 51 versus 46. This is a slow-paced game where, honestly, you could probably play it at these frame rates and it would be okay, although, to be honest, I'd probably still prefer to be at a higher refresh rate myself. So if you kick on FSR and DLSS at the quality settings, we can see the 5080 winning by 12% now, but overall frame rates on both are much higher, 82 versus 73. But again, it's always important to note when you're using upscaling that the upscalers are not producing the same image, even if they are producing a similar performance uplift. I would say in this game, though, it has a fairly good FSR implementation, and 4K has a lot of pixels to work from if you're just using quality level upscaling. So here, I would say the differences aren't as dramatic as what we saw at performance mode in Cyberpunk, but I still think that especially in motion and as objects are disoccluded, there's just a little more fizzling going on the FSR side of the screen and a little less detail being reconstructed. Also, this is the older CNN model of DLSS. I didn't go in and like manually override with the newer transformer model. I'm using what was built into the game. At 1440p, I don't think you need any upscaling. 77 FPS versus 84 at the maximum settings in this slow paced of a game I think is just fine, and it's a 9% win for the 5080. So this would be an example of, I don't think you'd care much which GPU you had, although the 5080 is definitely doing better. Silent Hill 2, though, as I mentioned in the intro, this game seems like a weird outlier in terms of non-ray traced results for a huge win for the 5080. I'm seeing a 56% lead for the 5080 here, 53 versus 34. Sometimes games are like this, where they just really are favoring one brand over the other in terms of the overall performance you get. Now, that being said, even the 5080 wasn't an amazingly high frame rate, so if you kick on DLSS quality and FSR quality, now the 7900 XTX is actually delivering 60 FPS here, but the 5080 is delivering 85, which is still a massive 42% advantage. And also, if you like freeze this and look carefully, like look at the hair. That's just one of the places we could look, but the DLSS reconstruction is getting more detail in that hair. I'd say that the FSR quality looks pretty usable here, but it is a little bit more pixelated. Also look at the edges of the character. Like as objects are disoccluded, watch as the arm swings when I push play again, and the arm swings over here. You'll notice that things are uncovered on this one. It'll look a little bit more fizzly. By the way, a higher quality upload without me jumping fast forward and everything like that is available on my channel members feed for just my uncut side-by-sides without me talking over it and pausing it and jumping ahead and all of that if you want to look at this in more detail. Anyway, if we go to 4K epic settings but with ray tracing turned on, the 5080's lead grows to 64%. Although even it's only hitting 46 FPS. So I think that while the 7900 XTX is doing even worse at 28, I think on both of them, I'd probably either turn down the settings or use upscaling. If we kick on DLSS and FSR quality, once again, same thoughts on image quality regarding the hair's a little sharper with DLSS, a little less fizzling as objects are disoccluded, and the 5080 is now hitting 67 FPS where the 7900 XTX is only hitting 44. So this is a noticeably better experience on the 5080. If we go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, we're now seeing a 88 FPS on the 5080, and the 7900 XTX is now hitting 58. It's a 52% advantage for the 5080, though. And again, if I pause it and we look at the details in the hair, objects being disoccluded, fizzling near the arms in motion as I play it again, all those same things are still there, but it's more exaggerated. The more aggressive the upscaling setting you use, I would say the larger you can notice the advantage for the DLSS upscaler. So I'm really hoping that FSR4 upscaling does a lot to catch up here, but we also don't know if that'll support the 7000 series. AMD has said they're focusing on 9000 series support, at least initially. Silent Hill 2 with 1440p epic settings with ray tracing turned on. Again, seeing a massive advantage for the 5080 by 60% at 77 FPS versus 48. This is a situation where the 7900 XTX, you'd probably want to upscale or turn down settings, whereas the 5080 would be perfectly happy just to play this at native resolution. If we do kick on quality level upscaling, the 5080 is now hitting over 100 FPS at 101. The 7900 XTX is now hitting 66, so it's getting a good frame rate, but a 53% advantage for the 5080 and an image quality advantage. Again, if you look at the amount of detail in the hair, the disocclusion, this is quality level, but we're at 1440p now, where the lower your rendering resolution is, once again, I feel like the more noticeable you can spot those differences in the upscalers. If we go to 1440p epic with no hardware ray tracing and no upscaling, it drops to a 38% advantage for the 5080, but it's 94 versus 68. Both are doing well, but it's certainly a much higher refresh rate experience on the 5080. But hey, if we move to another game like Ghost of Tsushima, now the 7900 XTX is winning by 3% at native 4K very high, and I'd actually say you don't need upscalers on either GPU here, and very high is the maximum graphics setting. We're seeing 78 FPS and 76 FPS. This is pretty much a tie. It's an 8% lead in the 1% lows at 68 versus 63 for the 7900 XTX, but again, this is really just basically a tie. They're both doing extremely well, although the XTX is actually getting a small win there. DLSS quality and FSR quality boosts frame rates to 111 and 119. The 5080 benefits a little bit more performance-wise from its upscale, and once again, I do think DLSS looks slightly better, but I will actually say, I feel like this is one of the better looking FSR implementations. I can mostly only see the differences in things like that bird that keeps flying back and around where the disocclusion under the wings fizzles a bit more on the FSR. But I actually think FSR is very usable here at quality settings at 4K. So anyway, small advantage for the 5080 here and a small image quality advantage as well as performance. But both are high frame rates and you probably could have played without upscalers as well. At 1440p very high, no upscaling, it's basically a tie. 1%, literally less than a 1% lead, 1 FPS, 130 versus 129 for the 5080 advantage. In the 1% lows, it's a 1 FPS win for the 7900 XTX. It's as close to a performance tie as you could possibly get, and neither one needs to turn down settings or use an upscaler. God of War Ragnarok, though, at 4K Ultra, no upscaling, is a bigger advantage for the 5080 at 25%. We're looking at 85 FPS versus 68. They're both very playable here, but it is noticeably a higher refresh rate experience on the 5080. If you do kick on quality level upscaling, the 5080's lead grows to 31%, so it's a little more, it benefits a little more from upscaling than the 7900 XTX does. 90 FPS versus 118, so they're both giving you a great experience. And again, similar thoughts on the upscaling, a little more disocclusion as the character's arm moves, a little more fizzle on that. With the FSR image and everything. But at the quality level at 4K here, it is very usable, but I do think DLSS looks better. At 1440p Ultra settings, no upscaling, it's a 17% lead for the 5080, so its lead drops, but it's still a noticeable 17% win at 117 versus 100. So they're both getting a great experience, to be honest, and I don't think you need any upscaling or anything at these frame rates in a single-player title. Final Fantasy 16 at 4K Ultra, the 5080 has a win, but it's only 6%, and it's only 53 FPS versus 50, so I don't really think, I'd probably settle for these settings. In this game, turning down graphic settings, I don't really like what it does. I prefer upscaling if it's usable upscaling settings. Quality's pretty good here at 4K, and again, similar thoughts on image quality. It's usable with FSR, but there is a little more disocclusion, fizzle, and things like that. 9% win for the 5080, 81 FPS versus 74, so I'm much more happy with the frame rates now. So they both get you good experience, but a bit faster on the 5080 and a bit better of an upscale to get you there. At 1440p Ultra, 6% win on the 5080, 92 versus 87. I don't think we need to turn down settings or upscale in a single-player title at these frame rates. Jumping to Horizon Forbidden West at 4K very high settings. This is another one where the 7900 XTX actually takes a bit of a lead, and an even bigger lead in the 1% lows. And here we're seeing pretty good frame rate, 77 versus 75, so we wouldn't necessarily need to upscale. However, if you do, now the 5080 takes a lead, so it's looking like it benefited more from upscaling here than the 7900 XTX did. It's getting 112 FPS now versus 98, so they're both giving you a great experience. 14% advantage now for the 5080 though, so it is noticeably faster, and once again we're using upscaling, so there's an image quality difference. If you look at the little details in the foliage, I think it's a little bit better on the DLSS side. If you look at the hair swinging in motion, I think just a little more fizzle and disocclusion and a little more pixelation on the FSR side of things. Again, you can pinch to zoom on mobile if you like, and again, there is a full side-by-side without me skipping ahead on the channel members' extra stuff. Anyway, 1440p very high settings is advantage for the 5080 by 8%, but they are both giving you a pretty great experience at 130 versus 120, and a bit of a lead in the 1% lows for the 7900 XTX. And that's all the tests that I ran for this comparison. So let's pop out for just quick final thoughts, because honestly, I did a lot of the wrap-up summary at the beginning. So again, what are you trying to even get out of this video? Because it could be a lot of different things. If you already have a 7900 XTX, is it worth upgrading to a 5080? I mean, I definitely consider it an upgrade, because if you look at all of the tests, there was only a small handful of games where the XTX was faster. But if you're not really playing a lot of the heavy ray tracing single-player titles, so we kind of filter out for that, well, then you're not seeing a massive win for switching to the 5080. So I think for a lot of people, just enjoy your 7900 XTX if you already have one. Maybe wait for another generation or two before upgrading. And I think you'll probably be in pretty good shape. Now, if you're somebody who is considering buying either one of these, and they're priced at all similarly, I would say if they're priced similarly, the 5080 is better. Get the 5080. It has a better upscaler. It does better at ray tracing, and even its raw performance is usually a little bit faster, although fairly close when you're not factoring ray tracing in. That being said, if the 5080 costs a lot more, because again, we're seeing bad scalper prices right now. I'm really hoping that settles down. Well, then no, it's kind of nonsense. And honestly, I'm hoping we get something out of AMD regarding their 9070 XT, because some rumors point to it being 7900 XTX-ish in performance, but with better ray tracing performance and FSR4 upscaling. That would be pretty interesting if it was priced right against a 5080. But if in reality it's noticeably slower than a 7900 XTX, then it's not really going to be a 5080 competitor, so like directly. So we'll have to see what comes of all of that in the future. So in general, this is kind of the usual AMD versus Nvidia thing. If you're not using ray tracing and upscaling heavily, then the AMD card can sometimes offer you a lot better value. But personally, if I'm spending in the $1,000-ish GPU range for this level of performance, this is a level of performance where the 5080 can, especially if you're on a 1440p display, it can deliver a good experience in the super heavy ray tracing titles. So if that's something you're interested in, the 5080 can do it, and the 7900 XTX can't. So 5080 is better. I wouldn't pay like an insane amount of money more for it, but I definitely think it is worth more. But a lot of that comes down to your use case, so make of it what you will, because the new market pricing right now, as of the time of filming, is kind of stupid for both. Although much more stupid for the 5080. Anyway, hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Have an excellent day.